Good afternoon, well, evening actually. It's 6 o'clock, a little later than usual, but welcome to the first of my Gender Speaker Live LGBT History Show. Hi, and welcome to the show, where today we're going to be talking about Magnus Hirschfeld. Now, Hirschfeld's probably one of the most influential and significant people in the history of the LGBT, or in LGBT history. And I just want to talk a little bit about what happened during his life, the impact he had, and some of the consequences for him, which were quite severe. So we'll dig straight back into it. Just want to remind you, don't forget, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my trans and non-binary inclusion workshop. That's on the 20th of October. Make a note in your diary there. You'll find the details in the show notes below. Well, they're not quite there yet, but they will be by the time you get there. So LGBTQ history, and here we are talking about Magnus Hirschfeld, born in 1868. Hirschfeld, as you can probably tell from the name, a Jewish doctor, born actually in what is now Poland, but very quickly moved to Germany and set up and established a practice in Berlin. Now, I think it's probably difficult for us to understand. We all know the various different names about people who's sexologists and psychologists and various things. But when you look at them, you suddenly realize that it all happened in that Bavarian area, that area of Austria, Germany. Obviously, the grandfather of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, which is around, he basically born just before Hirschfeld and died slightly afterwards. So definitely a significant influence on what was happening with Hirschfeld growing up and developing as a sexologist. Probably the most famous of the first of the real sexology practitioners, Richard von Kraft Ebbing, 1840 to 1904, a little bit before both Freud and Hirschfeld, and he developed this psychopathia sexualis, his big magnum opus is the word I'm looking for. There we go, magnum opus. That was his thing. Kraft Ebbing developed, it's interesting, words we use today and don't think about where they came from. He coined the word homosexuality, bisexuality, and sadism and masochism. These are all terms that he developed and created in his study of sexuality and deviant sexuality. That was particularly what he tended to call it. Sadism, named after the Marquis de Sade. Masochism, and I can't remember another nobleman whose name it came after. And it's interesting, I mentioned that because we'll look at Havelock Ellis in a second. But a lot of these terms coined at that time. Now, obviously, homosexuality, when it was coined, a term to describe people who were deviant in their sexual behavior. Heterosexuality came later in order to balance off homosexuality. What was the alternative to homosexuality? Well, the moment you say normal, that makes homosexuality abnormal. So that was one of the reasons why the terms heterosexual was developed to counter the homosexuality without making homosexuality other or abnormal, similar to bisexuality. So Henry Havelock Ellis, most of the rest, Kraft Ebbing, Sigmund Freud, Hirschfeld, all in that German area, along with Carl Jung and a few others, all at the same time. A huge development. The whole field of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy all developed in that area, supporting each other, developing and competing with each other. Havelock Ellis was actually British, but he had also started studying sexology and was very keen and interested in that. He developed a term after Hirschfeld, actually. He developed the term eonism to describe what we now know as transgenderism. And that came from the Chevalier Dion de Beaumont. Now, I'm going to do a history show about the Chevalier because it was quite an important, he's quite an important character in the history of trans development. But a particularly famous French nobleman in the court and Russian court and in Britain. And the Beaumont Society, the British support organization for it was originally for heterosexual cross-dressers, transvestites, that developed from the 60s and still exists today, was named after the Chevalier Dion de Beaumont. So that's really where we were with. This is what, just to put things in context, that, yeah, Hirschfeld wasn't the only person around. He was part of a movement which was changing very sharply as we came out of the Victorian era into the new Edwardian, into the 20th century. And that is what happened, that we started the 20th century with this big shift. Now let's have a quick share of my screen and have a look at a little bit more about Hirschfeld. Now, here's Magnus Hirschfeld, the man. Now, this is him in his older days. Hirschfeld was a gay man. Hirschfeld was also Jewish. And he was a gay rights activist, and probably the first really major gay right campaign was developed by Hirschfeld. It was in Germany. They were battling against what was called Paragraph 175, which was the piece of German law which made homosexuality illegal. And they were moving quite significantly forward. There was a challenge. A lot of people were very uncomfortable with the more flamboyant members of the gay community. Now, you've got to remember, back when this all started, there was no transvestism or transsexualism or transgenderism. It was all part of this gay community. Now, even the term gay, that was a 60s term. So we're talking about a term where homosexuality had been developed as a term, but mostly people referred to gay people as sodomites. In fact, they were all mostly slurs, the terms that were used, because it was frowned upon. Most countries in Europe, homosexuality was still illegal because trans was no different from homosexuality. It was considered the same. The fact that somebody dressed as a woman, if they were a man, they were still basically homosexual. They were still breaking the laws. They would have been breach of Paragraph 75. They would have been in breach of the British law as well. So this campaign was started up. Hirschfeld wrote a book in 1910 in which he coined the term transvestism. And this was an encounter to the term Eonism, which Havelock Ellis was trying to promote. And, well, as we know, Eonism lost out. He was trying to, Eonism was along the lines of masochism, sadism, Eonism, as it was all part of a, and it reflected, I think, and this is probably why it lost out, sadism and masochism were seen as fetishisms. And I think Ellis saw transvestism very much as a fetish as well. And that's why he embraced it in the same context as sadism and masochism. It was a fetishistic practice. Hirschfeld didn't. He actually was much more considered about this. And this is why he developed much more of the work that went on to help provide medical support for transvestism and transsexualism. In fact, most of the people described in Hirschfeld's book, most of the case studies he described as transvestite, today we would consider as transsexual, transgender. These were people who wanted to change their bodies, wanted to become men, wanted to become women, and move from one gender to another. And he worked with Lily Elbe, who I'm going to come to in a minute, and look at a little bit about what happened to her. She's the most famous and the first very public gender reassignment. But Hirschfeld, in his work on developing support for trans people, also worked very much with a German surgeon and started to look. Now, Ina Wagner and Gerda Wagner came to him because of the work that was going on. He'd established a gender clinic. He was doing a huge amount of work, compiling enormous amounts of research on sexual behaviors and sexual practices and trying to understand the differences between various different gay, lesbian communities. And Ina and Gerda, both artists. It's claimed that Ina was probably the better artist, but Gerda was the one who ultimately became the most famous, not because of of her skill as an artist, but because of her subject. If you've seen the film The Danish Girl with Eddie Redmayne, that was based upon a novel that was based upon the life of Ina Wagner. Ina apparently had one day, Gerda was completing a painting of a client, and the client couldn't turn up for the sitting. So she said to Ina, darling, would you mind just sitting in for me, and just so I can finish off. No, you're going to have to wear the dress because I need to be able to get the hem right. And Ina fell in love with wearing beautiful female clothes, and from that point onwards, slowly moved towards wanting to be Lily and wanting to live as a woman. Now, it's quite likely that Ina was actually not trans but intersex, that he actually had a quite feminine body, and there may have even been female parts. He developed this is the work of Gerda. We can see that Gerda was they were shall we say a less usual couple. Much of her art was actually quite erotic art in Victorian art terms. Ina developed life as Lily. This is him at the clinic, dressed as Lily. And paintings by Gerda kept turning up with this strange, alluring woman. Paintings that became very famous in the 1920s when this was all happening. And nobody was quite sure who the subject was, and slowly it came out as Ina transformed steadily towards being Lily. So it became clear that these were paintings, this very boyish style that became very famous in the 20s, may in some ways have been encouraged by paintings of a trans woman. So that's quite an oddity of the history. They did actually separate, although Lily, Gerda always loved Lily. And when she became ill, and when she was struggling with multiple surgeries, was there behind her. After Lily's death, Gerda never married again and really, really struggled to cope with it. 5 operations taking place, the last of which it was believed was an attempt to try and allow Lily to be able to have a baby, which even now we wouldn't even dream of trying. So that's the indication that when they were operating, they actually found on almost female reproductive system, and there was an attempt to try to make that function properly, but it didn't, and Lily sadly died. The book The Danish Girl was Lily had kept copious notes of what had happened during that period when she was being supported by Magnus and the surgeons. Those notes were then turned into a book about her life that became a huge bestseller at the time, and then was later taken on, and a novel based upon her life was then produced. So what we saw in The Danish Girl was a slightly fictionalized account of what had happened. Some of the names have changed, the names of surgeons, names of psychiatrists, etc. But that was the work of Magnus Hirschfeld. So I want to look now at what happened in Germany. Just let me, you may have seen this picture, May the 10th, of the book burning that took place in Germany. On May the 6th, 1933, the National Socialist Party took power, the Nazis. Let me just show you this short video.
In Berlin, wie in anderen Universitätsstädten Deutschlands, wurden undeutsche und unsittliche Bücher von den Studenten eingesammelt und öffentlich verbrannt. Der Scheiterhaufen auf dem Opernplatz in Berlin. Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels spricht zur Jugend.
Meine Kommilitonen, deutsche Männer und Frauen.
So that's Hermann Goering talking just after the National Socialists and Nazis came to power on the 6th. By the 10th of May, they were burning books. And what's not generally known is that those books were actually Magnus Hirschfeld's library. Hirschfeld had set up the Institute for Sexuality and had been studying and taking notes and research on all kinds of sexual practices, but particularly looking at homosexuality and transgenderism, transsexualism as we call it, transgenderism as we call it now, and had compiled a huge library of information. Hitler himself had actually called Magnus Hirschfeld the most dangerous Jew in Germany. So he wasn't particularly popular. As it happened, on May the 10th, 1933, Hirschfeld was on an extended American tour. He never ever returned to Germany. His institute was ransacked. The books were all taken out into the streets and burned. And that was the end of the work of Hirschfeld. Not unfortunately the end of what happened to people who were gay. Thousands of them were arrested. Thousands of them were sent into concentration camps. And sadly, we've never really focused on what happened to the gay men that were sent to the concentration camps, because they, some might think they had a harder time. They weren't gassed. That wasn't the fate of the gay. The gay men from Germany who were arrested. Many of them were Jews, but there were gay men from all walks of life were arrested and sent to concentration camps, where they became basically lab rats. They were treated in all kinds of medical treatments, looking for cures for homosexuality, looking for all sorts of ways to try and rid society of this practice. Very few survived. They wore a pink triangle rather than the yellow triangle, which is why that pink triangle has become a symbol of gay pride for many people today. So that was the life. What Hirschfeld did return. He returned to France and went to Nice, where he died on his 65th birthday. But that was the life of Magnus Hirschfeld. It was a difficult time. His work was not completely lost. While touring America, he'd met with Harry Benjamin. Some information and some of the details of his work were handed over and sent to Benjamin. And after the war, Benjamin set up his clinic, began work in America. And as we know, that by 1952, he had helped Christine Jorgensen, another Danish trans person, to undergo surgery. Or that was in Casablanca. And that work then began to go on. And Benjamin's work became the standards of care, which are now maintained by a separate organization, Warpath. And I'll be looking a little bit at the development of those standards of care and what Benjamin did. But there we are. That's Magnus Hirschfeld. Hugely influential. The first clinic for trans people. The first gay rights campaigner. Significant amount of influence in understanding and trying to make sense of what was going on, and laid the foundations for what has happened since. So there we go. That's my little introduction to Hirschfeld. I shall carry on next Sunday, another show. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to be looking at. I'm looking around at different things. I'm watching for things coming up in the news that might prompt a little bit of searching back into history. But I thought we'd start with Hirschfeld, and then I can build on that with work of Benjamin and various other people. Next Wednesday, I'm going to be doing another of my just general gender issues chats, interviews, and chats about gender. That's going to be every Wednesday. So join me next on the 7th of October, probably at about 4 o'clock. That's my target at the moment, although next week is the Professional Speaking Association annual convention. The first one we've had to do completely online, looking absolutely brilliant. Really excited about that. So I may learn an awful lot. I'm also transferring all of these shows onto podcasts, so you're going to be able to get hold of those. I'm just putting them up one a day at the moment, so they're not flooded on all in one go. But if you want those, you can. If you just look at your normal podcast app, and using iTunes, or if you're using, I use, what is it, Pod Addict, or anyway, whatever your preferred podcast app is, just search for Gender Speaker Live and you'll find the podcast there. Don't forget, look down for the details below. The trans and non-binary inclusion workshop, 2-hour workshop, going to be helping you to understand how to make the workplace more trans friendly, trans inclusive, and it's very simple. Come along, pay what you can afford. Recommend a minimum 20, but you pay what you can afford. So look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Hope you have you've had a good weekend, and well, looks like we're in for a fairly rough few days with the weather. But anyway, I look forward to seeing you next week. Let's see if I can find my, look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Take care.